Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another stream. Or I guess a non-stream, a offline stream test. Welcome back. Doing it again. Got the new camera set up. Got more streaming things set up. Got a good response last time to the stream thing that I posted. The response to the Ted Kaczynski essay. In general, people seem to like it. A lot of people very shocked to discover what my face looks like. And I know what that's like putting a face to a voice that you've only ever heard as a voice before. Whether or not you had a particular vision of what I looked like in your head, it's going to be weird seeing for the first time. And yeah. I appreciated all the nice comments and stuff. And yeah, the one last thing I want to mention before I get going is this. On the last stream, you probably noticed I was wearing a hat. I've been wearing a hat a lot lately, even though I never have before. And I think part of the reason is it's been helping me with my headaches. And I'm just noticing now, I think I'm using it to you can kind of see how there's these dents in my head, or not, it's like the muscles. I hold tension in these parts of my head. And I think I've been using the hat to force myself not to, or to because it's pressing against that. So it is a constant awareness reminder. I got it originally because even though I've never been a hat person, I've always been a migraine person and a light sensitivity person and a not liking sun on my bald head type person, or even before it was bald. But just never got a hat for whatever reason. I don't know why, but as soon as I got it, I was like, oh, this is great when I have a headache, actually. And I can pull it forward or back and it massages my head. But that's why I have this line on my head. And I could have just wore the hat again, but I lightly worried about people pegging me as a Tim Pool type who never wants to be seen in public without something covering the bald head. So just doing it with the scratch. So yeah, let's get started. Some criticism that we got in our subreddit. Some people may know, some may not, that there is a Seriously Wrong subreddit. It's not very active, but people have been posting there a bit more lately. And I saw this thread and I thought, oh, I might respond on Reddit. I've responded to a few people's posts on there, but then I thought, oh, I'm doing these streams and I'm thinking of different types of segments I can do. Oop, there we go, browser setting. And maybe this is one. I feel like this, responding to criticisms of the podcast, it seems like a great medium to do it in. So this person just started listening and has a question about the argumentation style. They understand the podcast is meant to convey a certain point of view, and that point of view, that conveyance can be helped or hindered by good or bad arguments, which I 100% agree with. So far, we agree, us and that person. From the dozen episodes they've listened to, one thing that stands out is that we do not accurately represent dissenting arguments. I would say this probably depends on which argument and in what context. Like often dissenting arguments only get a nod to, or don't get mentioned at all, or are mocked and characterized through the lens of incorporating what we think is ridiculous about them into our expression of the idea itself. It's a common thing people do. It's just a sidebar on mockery. People act as if mocking someone is this substanceless thing. And so therefore, on the one hand, if you're mocking someone, you're not making an argument. And on the other hand, if you're mocking someone, it doesn't matter. It's just jokes. It's not a big deal. The truth is that by mocking an argument in a particular way, you're usually implying what you think is wrong with the argument. I don't know how to explain it. Sometimes making an argument through what you imply can be more intuitively understood by people than making an argument through what you're like directly saying, through laying out every link in the causal chain. Like people just will get it if you're just like making a particular type of joke about it, especially people who already sort of agree with you, which like a comedy podcast that covers things like prison abolition and zero sum games in nature. This is pretty niche. So like, I think both for people who do agree with us and don't agree with us, who are involved in these arguments, you can often tell what our counter arguments would be, even if we don't fully lay them out in a philosophical way in the episode. We're just kind of joking about it or whatever. We put a lot of thought into what we're going to include and not include. And at the same time, we're just two people. And the things that occur to us in the couple weeks that we work on an individual episode might not be everything that could be said about a particular topic in a hour to 2 hour long podcast that dedicates a significant amount of its time to explicit comedy sketches. So let's get to the more specific criticism. This is a general criticism they have about many episodes, and we'll get to another one a bit later down the thread. But the first one that they bring up is that in our episode Zero Sum Pattern Grid World 210, we make the claim that there are very few zero-sum games in nature. And then that the opposing arguments we present, we give some complicated artificial situations which never exist, which I think I remember. And I even think I remember thinking this was a weakness of the episode as I was doing one of the many passes. But for this particular episode, it was such a meme anyway. We're talking about zero-sum pattern grid worlds. And also this is a theme we hit in a lot of episodes. It just kind of felt like, you know, it doesn't have to be fully complete or whatever, but specifically this thing of saying there's very few zero-sum games in nature. And then I can't remember the example. We start like goofing on it again. Like I'm saying, we turn it into a joke a lot of the time. We're like, oh, what if they set up an economy, the animals, or I don't remember what's actually in the episode, but I do remember doing some like hyperbole or something like that around that particular point. Do we not know that animals eat other animals? Just to be clear, we do know that. Sean and I both know that. I double checked with him before going live. We both know. And that is a clear zero-sum game. Well, in some sense, obviously, it is a zero-sum game. Like I don't want to be eaten. You want to eat me. One or the other is going to happen, and there's not really a in between. It is kind of a binary, and one person is going to win and one person is going to lose. Animal people, one animal person will win and one animal person will lose. And yeah, totally, that's a zero-sum game. But there's other aspects of those relationships usually that exist, and if you take those into account, sometimes it can provide a fuller picture that doesn't quite always look like a zero-sum game, which I think is a big part of the whole point we were trying to make in the episode. Just that a lot of the times what we're defining as zero-sum are what it's socially constructed, both in the sense that sometimes we design our society to make zero-sum games happen, but also that sometimes we read things as zero-sum games when we don't have to. And animals eating each other, like that's a, you know, zero-sum. I feel like that's a valid read for sure, but I do think there's other valid reads as well. So do we not know that a big part of evolution is zero-sum game? Pointing out that a huge amount of symbiosis and cooperation in evolution doesn't change the fact that zero-sum games are ubiquitous in nature. Ubiquitous is a strong word, but it just means widespread. So I think I would agree, though I wouldn't phrase it that way myself. A big part of evolution is zero-sum games, who survives, who doesn't, etc. The point of emphasizing the huge amount of symbiosis and cooperation in evolution is that has been historically underemphasized and led to a lot of social led to a lot of social ills and a lot of bad philosophy and bad political philosophy that has hurt people. And we'll get back to that point in a minute because of where this thread goes. But and just by the way, if anyone goes to the subreddit and reads it, like, it's already a 19-day thread. Don't bump the thread. Don't bother this person. I'm very aware that I don't want to like cause online harassment to anyone, even people whose arguments I disagree with in our subreddit. So the way that this thread unfolds is that this person responds and tries to explain basically our point, that you can look at a zero-sum situation in different ways. Even animals that are eating each other, there's a symbiosis in the cycle of life and death, and soil is made of dead things that flows back into the living, and there's a way you can frame these things not necessarily as zero-sum, and that what we're doing on the show, the main thread of our podcast is a narrative about standing apart from the competitive stance of capitalism, being intentionally biased to emphasize this non-competitive narrative to bring positive change. So this person is making good arguments using real examples to explain what we meant to this original poster, who says that they agree about humans and human culture, and that we should maximize win-win situations and reduce zero-sum games in human society. Good. That is a big part of the main point of what we're arguing. So they're already on board for the most part with the thing. The thing that is the sticking point is this claim about there are almost no zero-sum games in nature, and that we didn't bring up animals eating each other, which, fair enough. It would have been a good thing to bring up. If I'd thought of it, we would have included it in the episode. Honestly, if you asked me before I saw this thread, I would have said we did include it in the episode, because I would have just assumed that such an obvious thing would have been included. Why is this small? That's weird. No, not that. A big part of the argument of the episode was supposed to be that, like, we're focusing in on the predator eating the prey way too much. And we're acting as if everything that happens is that, or is like that in some metaphorical way. And we're saying, no, a lot of things aren't like that. And actually the best things aren't like that. And the things that help us the most aren't like that. And we should set up society to minimize those things, which is something this person agrees with. So good. So then we get, wouldn't it be a lot easier to just admit that they don't know what they're talking about or are using dishonest arguments rather than making up complicated rationalizations? I find it really interesting that they can read posts that address their point directly. Like, they're saying right there that we're being intentionally biased. So if you're the original poster, you can say, I think being intentionally biased is bad. They should present the other side of the argument fairly and respond to it in a calm, rational, direct manner, not mocking, not hyperbolizing, etc. You could just continue the conversation. Like, they gave you what you needed to continue criticizing us along these same lines. Their second example of what we got wrong is that in Library Socialism and the Irreducible Minimum, the opposing argument we present was, what about toothbrushes? And then we go into a huge amount of BS, like a comedy segment about how aerosolized poop can land on toothbrushes, and so every day we should return them to the toothbrush library and get a fresh, clean one that's been sterilized. It's a jokey comedy bit about a library socialist society and, do we have to return our toothbrushes? So the first thing I just want to mention is that that's not the opposing argument we presented. Throughout the 3 episodes, we presented many opposing arguments, all of them in the context of these comedy sketch opposing argument moments where we're like, here's the argument, and then we respond to it extremely quickly in a way that like we couldn't possibly have given it its due. You know what I mean? Like we're just being snappy retorts. We're not going into anything in super detail. So yeah, to wrap up the stream of how this conversation went, they continued to talk past each other essentially. So the person defending us, he says, if you want something methodical and you're not a troll, try Chomsky's book or him on YouTube. He should be methodical enough for you. Now, this is just a good faith suggestion of, hey, you're criticizing a comedy podcast. If you want something more methodical, try Chomsky lectures on YouTube. It's great advice. Isn't it interesting that instead of gauging with honest criticism, you jump to trolling accusations? To be clear, they did not accuse this person of being a troll. They said, if you're not a troll, try Chomsky's book on YouTube. So it's just really dishonest to say that instead of gauging with honest criticism, they're jumping to trolling accusations. But also, that this, instead of engaging with honest criticism, is not true, because they did engage with your honest criticism in an extremely honest and direct way. They just weren't doing it in the way that you want it. Like, you want to have a conversation about, are we being dishonest, or are we being just merely uninformed? And the response is that it's neither. It's that we're presenting a narrative. We're presenting a mindset through comedy, through our political arguments, through this show that we put on. Like, it's entertainment, not a philosophy dissertation. It tries to be informative entertainment, and we try not to ever say things that aren't true or give people the wrong impression, but we are trying to give them the impression of how we see things, and that's the thrust of what we're doing. And the miscommunication continues. So he's saying, I'm not criticizing the content of the podcast. I'm criticizing how opposing views are misrepresented. They're saying, I'm completely fine with caricatures for beginners. Just building an understanding of the alternative philosophy is more important than repeating the rhetoric of other more common mindsets. This is exactly right. This is exactly why we do the show the way we do it. It's for beginners. We're trying to immerse people in a particular mindset and saying, look at all these things through this way of viewing the world. So you're criticizing the way our views are being misrepresented, and this person is telling you why we use caricature. So it's a direct response to what this person is saying. But they say, still missing the point. I'm not criticizing the content. I'm criticizing how opposing views are misrepresented. Like, it's amazing to me that this person doesn't understand that their point has been directly responded to. And it's tragic to me that the conversation couldn't actually continue, because I feel like the person who was responding, suggesting what they thought our responses would be, or how they see the podcast, or why we're doing these things, was doing a really good job. And I feel like it could have been a great conversation if there had been engagement. And there was more other comment threads too, but the way that unfolded was really interesting to me. And then, so I want to get into tragedy of the commons. I want to address this because we actually have addressed it on the podcast before, but not in the Library Socialism trilogy. And I think it's in an episode that's in the archive now behind the paywall. Like, it was a while ago when we talked about this. So the tragedy of the commons, for those who don't know, describes a situation in economic science where, there we go, where individual users who have open access to a resource unhampered by shared social structures or formal rules that govern access and use, that does a lot of work, act independently according to their own self-interest, contrary to the common good of all users. So this idea was first proposed in 1833 by an English economist, William Foster Lloyd. who published this pamphlet where he talks about a hypothetical situation where too many this common grazing land is available for all the cattle herders, and because their individual self-interest maximizing nature, as an economist knows, that's how we all are, will lead us to want to continue expanding our stock of cattle and using as much of the shared land as possible for our own benefit, because it's a public resource that's available to anyone to graze their cattle on. Economically, it makes sense to me to try and use as much of it as I can to make profit for myself. That's the economic rational thing to do. And since all people will do this, that will result in overgrazing. But if one big entrepreneur business owner owns the land, they will have an incentive to not overgraze it, because they'll only want to use as much of that. They'll want to keep regenerating, that's they will want to be good stewards of their own land to ensure their continued business success. So it's an idea that's been floating around for a while. In 1968, an ecologist, read ecofascist, Garrett Hardin, explored this social dilemma in his article, Tragedy of the Commons. So he develops the idea quite a bit in this article, but just further than this own pamphlet, the original pamphlet. The main answer to the tragedy of the commons is that, first of all, this is not what always happens. And there's another term called the comedy of the commons that was coined to describe situations where sometimes having a whole bunch of different people all using a resource together makes the thing better. And the main example that people point to nowadays is Wikipedia. But the article, The Comedy of the Commons, was written like in the 1980s as well, as a response to the Hardin article. And so it's not just about Wikipedia or open source software, though. Those are the main ways people talk about the comedy of the commons today. But just in general, the real argument against the way at least people use the tragedy of the commons, the way that the person on the subreddit is using the tragedy of the commons, is that this part: unhampered by shared social structures or formal rules that govern access and use. Like, maybe if they're responding to a particular type of anarchist who believes that we shouldn't have shared social structures or rules that govern access and use of shared resources, then that's a good potential counter argument to common property. But if you're advocating for common property in a library socialist society, this thing that we coined on our comedy podcast as a way to pump intuitions about what a socialist society might be like, a lot like a library in a lot of ways, and that is specifically based around usufructian property rights, the idea that property should be held in common like it is at a library, and then made available to people to use and enjoy, usufructian property rights, like a library makes a book available to people to use and enjoy. Crucially, usufructian property rights does not include the right to dispose of or destroy property, because you can't ruin a library's book on purpose. They'll charge you for it. The idea is that we want other people to be able to use and enjoy the book afterwards. So there are shared social structures and formal rules that govern the access and use of goods in a society like we were proposing in those episodes, a library socialist society where all human needs are made available to people on a usufructian basis, in the same way that books are made available to people on a usufructian basis in a library. And yeah, we kind of make the joke about toothbrushes and would you need to return your toothbrushes and whatnot. We're just having some fun. But yeah, the tragedy of the commons literally only applies. I got sidetracked here and never finished this point, but what I meant to say was that the tragedy of the commons only applies, in theory, to systems that are unhampered by shared social structures or formal rules that govern access and use. And the library socialist society we were proposing in those episodes was explicitly said to be based off of how libraries function, and therefore does have shared social structures and formal rules that govern access and use. A very clear parallel to our own world about how those shared social structures would work. That's the whole point, is to make that parallel and to imply those social structures would be similar. So the tragedy of the commons, by definition, but the first sentence in the Wikipedia article, does not apply to us and to what we're proposing with library socialism. Yeah, the tragedy of the commons literally only applies in theory, because again, it's not like an empirically demonstrated phenomenon. And in fact, if we scroll down to just the second paragraph in the Wikipedia article, when you look at things empirically, sometimes shared access resource systems collapse due to overuse, like overfishing, but often they don't, and that communities manage resources prudently without collapse. Sometimes they even create what's called perfect order. And Elinor Ostrom won a 2009 Nobel Prize for Economic Science for demonstrating this concept in her book, which includes examples of how local communities were able to do this without top-down regulations or privatization. So the tragedy of the commons is a proposed phenomenon that only applies in an extremely limited scenario that, when you look at the real world, isn't all scenarios, isn't potentially even most scenarios, and certainly isn't the scenario that we were advocating for in that episode. So while it would have been a good thing to bring up in the library socialism trilogy, Tragedy of the Commons, it's not a very good argument. And there's a lot of easily available counter arguments to it. Again, just you can tell this bothered me a little bit. Do we not know this rebuttal, or did we purposely leave it out because it defeats our position? Neither. I know about it. We've already rebutted it on the show, and we left it out because we didn't think about it, because it's a bad argument that even economists nowadays just know isn't true. Like, it was over a decade ago, someone won the Nobel Prize pointing out how it's not true. All that said, those are the arguments against the tragedy of the commons. I think it's also important to note that Garrett Hardin, the person who developed the idea in the modern era, as I said, is literally just like an ecofascist. So I don't want to go over everything to do with Garrett Hardin. A quick look over the Wikipedia association with white nationalism, neo-Malthusian approach, living within limits. Obviously we should live within limits, but the neo-Malthusian approach in Tragedy of the Commons is like, essentially he argues that by providing people with what they need to survive, what am I doing here? Hardin blamed the welfare state for allowing the tragedy of the commons, where the state provides for children and supports overbreeding as a fundamental human right. Malthusian catastrophe is therefore inevitable, and Hardin stated in his analysis of the tragedy of the commons that freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. Okay, so Hardin is an eco-fascist, and that doesn't make his arguments inherently wrong, but I just responded to the arguments, and I do think that it's important to note where they're coming from and why. Hardin was the type of ecologist who had a lifelong commitment to things like eugenics. In his book, Biology, Its Human Implications, a college textbook that covers the basics of biology, he included a quote: "As long as our present social organization continues, there will be a slow but continuous downward trend in average intelligence, and the sterilization of the feeble-minded has been opposed for various reasons. One of the strongest reasons is the feeling that it somehow interferes with the rights of the individual. In discussing this point, one must first emphasize that sterilization alters an individual in one respect only. It keeps them from having children. Decades later, his 1993 book, Living Within Limits, thanked the pro-eugenics founder of the Pioneer Fund. He collaborated with racist academic Virginia Abernathy, who later described herself as an ethnic separatist. And that book, Lifeboat Ethics, according to Cory Doctorow in his article about Hardin, deploys the time-worn authoritarian metaphor of a lifeboat as a justification for exterminating racialized and poor people. A few more things from the Doctorow article that I think are useful. Hardin's work serves as a greased slide from environmental thought. Humans abuse their natural environment. To sociopathic capitalism. Helping poor people just encourages them to have more babies they can't afford. To full-on extremist genocide. There's only room for some of us on this planet, and the sooner we get rid of the surplus, the better. The reason that I think it's important to point out that this is the person who popularized the argument about the tragedy of the commons is that, like us on our podcast episode about being against zero-sum games, where we were pushing a particular narrative about how cooperation is good and people ought to cooperate more. And hey, if you look in nature, there's actually a lot more cooperation going on than you might think. And if we think about things differently, we can often take something that seems like a zero-sum game and make it not a zero-sum game anymore. And in general, doing that is good. And in general, conceiving of everything as if it's a zero-sum game makes life worse for everyone. That's the narrative we were pushing. And we were pushing that narrative because we believe that a society where everyone has their needs taken care of, a society like the one we describe in our Library Socialism episodes, would be good for everyone who participates, and it would be good for society to move in that direction. And that's why we do political advocacy through our comedy show. So that's what we're going for there. What Hardin was going for with his 1968 essay on the tragedy of the commons was stopping poor people from breeding, keeping the IQ of the human population high through eugenics, through selective sterilization of low IQ people, of seeing society as a lifeboat where only some people should be invited to continue to survive. That's the narrative, that's the ideas, that's the goal that Hardin was pushing towards with that essay. And that's why it has the blind spots that it did, and why our show had the blind spots that we did. So getting all that kind of backstory and stuff is really helpful in parsing information. That's why the person who was responding in the thread was talking so much about where we get our ideas from and what our intentions with the podcast are, because that explains why we approach arguments in a particular way. And in the same way, knowing about Hardin's goals helps us know why he approaches arguments in a particular way. So that's my response to the criticism on the subreddit. I think that while the two specific things that they mentioned would have been good to include in those specific episodes, neither of them are really that great of arguments against what we were saying. And the reason they weren't included was merely that we didn't think of those specific ones, but we addressed similar arguments. But on the other hand, yeah, we just don't cover everything. Sometimes we miss something obvious even, or we get facts wrong, we do things wrong. One thing that I'm actually hoping to start potentially doing with these streams is maybe like a debrief stream after an episode, maybe like a week after an episode drops. We can have people in the chat asking us questions about the episodes, posing things that we didn't get to or didn't think of, extra information that we should have included, things we maybe said that were wrong or misleading or should have had extra caveat. Like, I feel like after we release an episode, we often get a lot of great feedback, and then there's no way to really incorporate that into the episode. So having these like after streams might be a way to kind of do that, to do something similar to what I did here and add to a particular episode or respond to particular criticisms. This is one of the things that we were potentially going to do, streaming on this channel. And yeah, so thanks for watching this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, check out our Patreon. That is what is going to help us keep making the podcasts we make, help us keep doing more of these streams. A big reason why I've even been able to start thinking about doing these streams is that the Patreon has allowed us to start getting a bit of help in the podcast editing space, which, like, I'd just been the only person editing the podcast at first because Sean was still working full time, whereas I was getting part time, getting a bit of payment from the podcast. And then once Sean was able to quit his job, he moved right into animating on Papa and Boy. So I continued being the main only audio editor, and it's so tiring. And I'm so happy that we have been able to hire a bit of help and like get me some help with that. And I've been able to maybe do a bit of this and do some other things. So that's like super exciting for me. And yeah, if you want to help us continue making the show that we make normally, the podcast, to keep doing this, to keep experimenting with other things as well, please head over to our Patreon and support us. And like and subscribe. Oh yeah, the YouTube things too. Like and subscribe, everybody, please. Thanks. Bye.